All right, so Josh, thanks very much for the introduction and the welcome. Thanks to everyone who is here, particularly if it's early in the morning for you or very, very late at night. As Josh said, I'm Brad Chamberlain. I'm the technical lead of the Chapel team, and this is a tradition we've done at ChapelCon and Chew over the years, basically a state of the Chapel project talk. And this is one of my favorite talks to give because it's kind of great to look back and look at sort of some of the greatest hits from the past year. And it's also one of the most intimidating ones because this community accomplishes so much in a year. It's hard to cover that all in a half hour's time. And so I've done the best I can here today. If I've left off one of your favorite pieces, please don't be offended. There's a lot to cover. And with that, let's dive right into it. So first of all, we're here on day 3 of ChapelCon. And so I'd like to sort of assume that if you're here, you probably know what Chapel is. But given this is the beginning of the 3rd day, I'll just do this one slide if you happen to board this plane and not realize you're flying to Chapel today. So Chapel is a modern parallel programming language, by which we mean it's sort of post-C, C++ Fortran. It's portable and scalable, so it runs on laptops, can make use of multi-core and GPUs there, can scale up to the largest supercomputers, making use of all the cores and GPUs there as well. It's open source and collaborative. We do all of our development on GitHub. And the 2 main goals of Chapel are to support general parallel programming, any parallel algorithm on any parallel hardware, and to make parallel programming at scale far more productive than it is using conventional techniques. So that's your one-slide intro to Chapel. Normally from here I'd go on and talk about productivity, but today we're going to dive right into the highlights of the past year. And one of the biggest ones for many of us, I think, is the release of Chapel 2.0. So talking about this in terms of timeline, when we last saw many of you, it was at Chew 2023 at the beginning of June last year. We do releases quarterly on the Chapel project. So since then, in fact, right after then, we released Chapel 1.31, and then in September 1.32, 1.33 in December. And then this past March, our most recent release, we released Chapel 2.0. And this is a big milestone release for us. The theme, the goal of this release was to stabilize the core language and library features. The idea is if you're using that sort of stabilized core, in subsequent releases, you should not have to update your code. You shouldn't have breaking changes. So this, again, was released March 21st. And the previous 2 releases served as our release candidates. So they were an opportunity for users or developers to give last-minute feedback about, like, wait, I think we need to fix this before we kind of lock that in the current definition. If you're new to Chapel 2.0, or for that matter to Chapel, we wrote a blog article. There's a link over here on the side, and all these slides will be made available with their links. And this is a great introduction to Chapel in general and the Chapel 2.0 release specifically. So I would encourage you to look at that. It was written by Daniel on our team. It's a really great introduction to Chapel and overview. Looking at what went into stabilizing Chapel, one of the big things we've been focused on for the last few years has been stabilizing the standard libraries. This is where we were a year ago, again, when we saw many of you here at Chew. Each of these columns is basically a library or maybe a small family of libraries within the standard libraries, and the different gradations of color here show how far along we were in reviewing the library at that time. And as you can see, we still had a lot of work ahead of us a year ago. And happily, through a big effort across the whole team, we went through and got this set of libraries all stabilized. This is sort of the suite we had set out to try to stabilize by 2.0. And so we're really proud and successful to get to that point. I should note that not every feature in every one of these libraries is necessarily stable. So this review process was basically figuring out what could be stabilized and then marking things that are that still felt like they needed more work or tuning with an unstable feature. We'll talk more about that in a couple slides. So again, this is the library process. We're also, during this period, looking at, like, is there anything wrong with the language we need to change at the last minute? And we were still getting input from users pretty much right up to that 2.0 release about things that ought to change. I'm not going to read through this list. There's a lot of detail here. You can read more about this in our release notes if you're interested, but suffice it to say, a lot of work was going on here as well. And I want to again note that this 2.0 stabilization effort was kind of a whole team effort. It was sort of all hands on deck within our team. But I particularly want to call out Lydia Duncan and Michelle Strout, who headed up this effort and kept us all organized and on track. It was a massive amount of coordination, and we could not have gotten it done without their leadership. And again, appreciate everyone on the team who put time into this, because sometimes it was a little bit of a drudge to get through it all. All right, so what's next now that we're past 2.0? Well, first of all, the obvious thing is Chapel 2.1. We're continuing with our every 3-month release schedule, so that's scheduled for the end of this month. We're continuing to stabilize features. So we talked about stabilizing the core language and library, but there's a bunch of stuff we said, well, this isn't core or not ready to be stabilized. And so we're going to be working on stabilizing those features and particularly prioritizing things that users or developers on the team think like this really needs to be stabilized. And some examples are the sort module, something we had hoped to stabilize for 2.0, didn't quite get done, working on that now. The dmapped keyword is a keyword that we marked unstable because we weren't that happy with it, but we'd like an equivalent to that. And if you're a user who is very focused on, invested in stability, what you'll want to do is compile your code with --warn unstable to see where you're using unstable features. And if there are features you'd like us to stabilize so that you're not relying on them, that's great feedback for us to hear. If you don't really care about stability, you don't need to use this flag and keep going as we have. The other thing we need to do is, we're not so proud to think we probably got everything right in 2.0. So we want to establish some means of making future changes to the language and doing that with the community's buy-in. So we've been talking about, is it time to create a Chapel language advisory board? How would that work? Who would be on it? Things like that. And if you have thoughts here, that's something we'd be very interested in hearing. With that, let me shift to another highlight since last year, community focus. So we did this all-hands effort on 2.0, and once that was done, suddenly some of us had some cycles to spare again after kind of being heads down in this for the last several years. And so what many of us have shifted our focus towards is nurturing the Chapel community. So kind of when we were in this 2.0 effort, I think we sort of had our heads down. We were listening to users, particularly around 2.0 things, but we weren't necessarily as responsive or good about nurturing the community as we have been at points in the past. So we're really reviving that effort by supporting existing users better, seeking out new use cases and users, and trying to really amplify our message about Chapel. And to some extent, this has become our new all-hands activity, although some of this is also technical work still that the engineers are doing because there's engineering work that also helps grow the community. Since we last saw you, we have hired the team's first ever community manager, Sarah Coughlin. You've probably heard from Sarah in this run-up to ChapelCon, whether or not you know it. She's been doing a lot of the advertising and getting the word out about it, and we've had great registration numbers this year as a result of that effort, so that's been very exciting. So we're really happy to have Sarah on the team, and she's really been helping spearhead this effort, focusing on the Chapel community. And so we've kicked off a number of initiatives with this community focus in mind. A couple that are really easy just to cover in bullets here. First of all, this rebranding of what used to be called Chew to ChapelCon came about as a result of this, including the changes in format, the new tutorial day, some of the new activities we did yesterday. And so that's really credited to this sort of expansive grow the community mindset. We've also renewed our focus on resolving user GitHub issues. So we closed 140 user issues since we saw you last year. Just as a point of comparison, the previous year we closed about 88. So you can see a pretty significant uptick there as well. Another effort we've been doing is really looking at doubling down on the Chapel blog. The blog is still relatively new to our project. In fact, last year was the year we announced it. And at that point, we had basically sort of done this initial push where we had a welcome article and this big push on the 12 Days of Chapel Advent of Code series. Then we did some release announcements. And we also had a small series that was written by our visiting scholar, Scott Bachman. But we hadn't done a ton of publishing when we saw you last year. And that continued to some extent over the past year, where since we saw you, we did a couple more release announcements. We had a really nice write-up on Chapel activities at SC23, another release announcement, but you can see sort of not a whole lot going on here. And as we got into these final 3 months going into 2.0, and things were starting to be ready on 2.0, we really started turning a lot of attention here and publishing both much more frequently and on a much broader variety of topics. So again, this sort of reflects a newfound goal to sort of try to publish a blog article every couple of weeks at a minimum. And so again, something we're trying to do to amplify our message, get it out there, get it into people's hands. Social media, similarly, we're looking to improve our frequency. I think in the past, we've typically done a tweet every week or two, or maybe month if things were quiet. We're really trying to set a goal of like, what would we tweet if we were to tweet once a day or once every 2 days, things like that. And I use the word tweet, but we're talking about Facebook as well as Twitter here. We've also, since we saw you last, added new LinkedIn and Mastodon accounts for our project. And if those are platforms that you use, we highly encourage you to follow us there and to help by retweeting and amplifying our messages if you're up for doing that. That's always really appreciated. We've also been working on updating our website. If you've encountered our website, hopefully you find it serviceable and full of good resources, but maybe looking a little bit old-fashioned these days. And if used on smartphones, it's pretty much unusable, as I understand it. What we're doing is we're starting out by designing an Arcuda website that is more modern, more sort of slick, more visually appealing. And then from that experience, we're in a process currently of redesigning the Chapel website and re-implementing it. So hopefully by the time we talk to you next year and well before that, we'll be in a state where the Chapel website sort of reflects the modern times and again is very usable on your smartphone. There are many, many, many other things we're doing in this community-oriented effort that I've mentioned. We've really tried to do a strong uptick in the number of talks and tutorials that we're giving. And in fact, if you're at a place where you're like, I think it would be great to have a Chapel talk or tutorial or an Arcuda talk and tutorial here, let us know. We'd be more than happy to do that. We are increasing the number of ways in which we release Chapel, trying to meet users where they are rather than sort of requiring them to come to one of the few ways that we've released it in the past. You can see a list of that here. We're applying to HPSF. We're creating a series of YouTube videos about how to do things in Chapel for sort of asynchronous learning. We're reviving an educators forum, which is something we haven't had for many, many years now. Talking about kicking off a quarterly newsletter, maybe having a community office hour that people can drop in and ask questions. And I want to say that we're very interested in your feedback and your ideas about what could be helpful to you to grow the community. So please let us know that if you have any ideas there. And I'll also say that any of you, if you have a passion for growing the community, growing awareness of Chapel, or even just mentioning us as you're doing your work, that is always appreciated, and you'd be surprised how effective it can be. Speaking of that, one of our community members who really has a heart for this kind of activity, I think, Luca, is speaking today about some of the efforts that he has been doing in this area, and so we're looking forward to that talk very much. The last thing I'm going to say on the community front is that we've launched our first ever Chapel community survey. You can view this as kind of a census of the project, if you will. And I'd like to say that anyone attending ChapelCon or watching this video after the fact, we would really love for you to fill this out. Whether you're a seasoned Chapel programmer or somebody brand new to the language, maybe this is your first activity. We want to hear about you, what your background and interests are, initial impressions, or years of experience, sort of what your insights are. I also want to note that we'll be advertising a survey about this ChapelCon event itself, more about like what went well and poorly. So there are 2 surveys we'll be talking about today. We'd love for you to fill out both. Just wanted to make sure to shine a light on this one. With that, let me just talk to some of the technical advances since last year. I'm going to start with GPUs. I mentioned that a lot of our technical work is also focused on growing the community, and this is certainly the case. We think of GPU programming using conventional techniques as being reasonably low level and often vendor specific, and this is an area where we really think Chapel has an opportunity to make a big impact. So let's talk about what's happened here in the past year. So a few highlights just in bullet form. The first is we've dramatically improved AMD support since we saw you last year. So our official releases now support multi-locale and multi-GPU runs, and I'll show you some results of those runs in a moment. And we consider the features on AMD to be in parity with NVIDIA now. So you could write one Chapel code, compile it for either GPU, and essentially have the same thing happen modulo differences in the architectures or the vendor support itself. We've introduced new CPU as device mode. This is helpful if you're doing GPU development, but you maybe don't have a GPU on the system you're on, much like the way you can develop Chapel applications for supercomputers on your laptop and then deploy them by recompiling there. We've improved the integration of the GPU features with the Chapel language. So some things that we could do kind of in roundabout ways maybe last year are now better integrated with the first-class features of the language. And we've also got great performance scaling results and increased usage from end users, which I'll talk about on the next few slides. Performance is actually hard to talk about succinctly. We could easily talk this whole half hour about performance improvements on the GPUs. Here, what I've decided to do instead is dazzle you with some of the graphs and visuals that have been in our release notes over the past year. But we could talk about these in breaks or a talk at your institution in more detail if you're interested in that. I want to call out a couple of papers that were published just a week or 2 ago at IPDPS workshops, both from the user community, or I should say outside of my team, and both focused on GPUs and portability. And these were really exciting papers to see people writing. If I remember right, I don't think there are any HPE co-authors here. We really enjoyed reading your papers. We hope they were well received, and we're really happy to have this work out in the community. So kudos to Josh and Guillaume for getting these out there. I'm not going to summarize this work. We'll be hearing from both Josh and Guillaume later today, so we may be hearing a little bit about this in their talks. This is our application slide that I've been using for about the past year, showing different applications that people have done in Chapel and the diversity of computations people are doing. And so one of the nice trends this past year is that the number of these applications that are using or working on using GPUs is significant, more than just one or two. And that's been really exciting to see. And this relates to some of those publications we just saw. I'm going to focus back in again on this CHOP. This is the one that Guillaume worked on, and also Tiago has worked on, to mention some paper that's coming out this summer from Tiago at Europar. And this is an exciting paper to us because it has scaling results on Frontier and Perlmutter, two of the big DOE exascale systems, scaling up to 1,000 AMD GPUs and 512 NVIDIA GPUs, and getting performance that's very competitive with the reference versions. So again, work we're really excited to see getting published and advertised here. And we'll be hearing from Tiago a bit later today, again, potentially about work like this. I also wanted to mention Brett's talk later on today. It's not related to this specific effort, but it is on this theme of scaling Chapel using GPUs on DOE systems. So very thematically related to what I was trying to get across on this slide. If you're interested in GPU programming in Chapel, a couple other resources. We've got a blog series we've kicked off, which is a good way to learn about some of the features. And then this July, HPE sponsors a monthly online kind of seminar format. And Jade and Engen will be doing a version on the GPU programming features in July. That is free and online. We'd encourage you to join that if you'd like to hear more about GPU programming in Chapel. And of course, there'll be other talks today on that as well. One of which is our keynote. So Paul Sathry from Virginia Tech, as you heard from Josh earlier, will be giving our keynote today. I'll be introducing him later on, but at a high level, he's been looking at the GPU features for the past maybe year and a half or so, and is going to be talking about some of those experiences, as well as his more broad experiences and insights into GPU programming and the like. All right, let's talk about scalability and performance, always a highlight of looking back on a year. This is my favorite new performance graph I haven't showed you in Chew before. This is the Bail index gather computation, sort of a very distributed random access kind of computation. And this is scaling up to 4,096 compute nodes, so hundreds of thousands of cores. And we see Chapel here scaling very nicely. And we also see it outperforming the SHMEM versions that are the reference versions of this benchmark, which also simply stopped working at some point because they hit a limit in their implementation as to how many nodes they can target. That is a limit that could be addressed, but in the current versions at least, that's where they stopped running. So a result I've been very excited to share this past year. Over the past year, we've also been looking at a variety of different communication patterns through benchmarks crossed with different networks, where we've been looking at particularly Slingshot 11, InfiniBand, and AWS networks. This, for example, is just showing you the ISX benchmark across those three platforms or three network platforms. I just want to say that, in some cases we found things are working great. In other cases, we found areas to improve. So this has been really a valuable thing for us to go back and do this past year. One of the things we've done to try to improve some of these cases is to introduce this new concept of co-locales. If you've used Chapel before, you probably know that a locale is like a piece of your target system that can run tasks and store variables. And typically, any given compute node has been a locale in Chapel. So what we've been doing with this co-locale effort is basically giving you the ability to run multiple locales per compute node. And so where normally you might run like with -NL8 to say run on 8 compute nodes, here I'm saying 8 by 2, which means let's use 8 nodes, but 2 locales on each. And so typically, you're going to use this to run like a locale per NIC, if you have multiple NICs on your compute node, a locale per socket, per NUMA domain, per L3 cache. And if it's not obvious, the reason you might want to do this, there are a couple main ones. This can give you better network utilization if you have multiple NICs, and it can generally give you better memory locality and affinity given the hierarchical nature of compute nodes today. And for that memory case, this little table down here shows as I ramp up the number of colocales on this highly hierarchical compute node, we get increased performance. And we have similar results I didn't fit in here today about improving communication by using multiple NICs and multiple colocales. A lot of times when we talk about performance in Chapel, we're talking about scalability, parallelism, these really big runs. But something else I really wanted to call out this year is we've made some great improvements to just the serial or vectorized code that each task is running on a given core. This is kind of hard to talk about succinctly, so what I've done is pulled out an example of where we've really seen a win here. Last year when we saw you on the computer language benchmarks game, our n-body version was about 1.4x slower than the fastest version, the baseline version, if you will, and there were Rust and Julia and Fortran and C++ versions that all outperformed it. This year, when the computer language benchmarks game published its new results with the Chapel 2.0 release, we found that we were the new baseline. We were at the top of the stack here. And this was without any source code changes to that n-body implementation itself. So this reflects the kinds of improvements that have been made in the generated scalar or vector code through LLVM improvements and us improving the way we convey information to LLVM. So a really exciting result for us. And I'll be talking more about the computer language benchmarks game a little bit later on today. As far as tools go, we've typically been stuck in this chicken and egg situation with tools in Chapel where users don't really want to use a new language without tools, but tools teams don't really want to support a new language until it has users. And our team has historically been too busy on the compiler and the libraries and the language to really focus very much on tools. So what tools we have today have typically come from the open source community, some of you on the call, in fact. And so one of the talks we'll be hearing about today is from an effort at Western Washington to develop some debugging support from Chapel, for Chapel as a senior project. That's coming up right after this talk, if I'm remembering right. And then happily, through some of the Dino compiler rework we've been doing, we've actually introduced some new tools ourselves on the team, including a language server, giving you modern sort of conveniences in your editor, a linter, and then a VS Code extension, which, as I'm sure many of you know, is kind of probably the most popular editor, particularly among sort of generations younger than me, let's say. We'll hear more about these efforts from Daniel and Jade later on today. So some nice improvements on tooling here. To me, this is one of the really most exciting things from the past year. All right, I am running out of time. There's, again, so much more I could cover here. I want to leave some time for questions. So let me just bop through a couple things really quickly. First of all, I tried to mention a few of the talks we'll be hearing about today, but there are many, many other talks that I didn't find a way to weave into this narrative in time. So I just want to say that, stick around. We'll be hearing about a lot of different aspects of the project, a lot of different things that people are doing today. A lot of this I'll be hearing about for the first time myself, and I'm very excited based on the abstracts that I've read online. I also wanted to bring a couple updates from people, sort of CHU alumni who won't be here or be presenting at least today. The first one is from the Champs team, who we haven't heard from here at CHU or ChapelCon for a couple of years. But checking in with them, they sent this slide, which I'll just summarize as they're very alive and well. Where the first couple of years of Champs were really focused on getting their CFD framework up and running and sort of competitive with the state of the art, I think for the last couple of years, they've really been focused on how can we now do new science and science at new scales using this framework. And so it's kind of gone from this sort of, implement what everyone does mode to kind of solving new, really hard problems. And Eric, the PI, writes that they're looking at things that are an order of magnitude more complex as they're looking at these aircraft designs that meet environmental targets that everyone's trying to hit nowadays. Their big annual conference is coming up in July, and they're currently heads down working on a number of papers to present there. So we wish them luck in that and hope to hear about some of that work here maybe next year at ChapelCon. Next up, I'm going to pop back in time a little bit. At PA-ATM, which is a workshop at supercomputing, Scott Bachman and Tom Westerhout presented papers this past year. These were both, I think, great papers, and from what I hear, I wasn't there, great presentations, and we really appreciate them highlighting their work in that forum. Excuse me, couldn't find the mute. I also wanted to mention that if you are doing applications work in Chapel, this PA-ATM workshop is a great one to know about. It's at Supercomputing, which is our industry's biggest event of the year, so a great place to highlight your work. The deadline is coming up at the end of July, or towards the end of July, and they support both research papers with original work and talks on existing work. So again, if you're doing applications work in Chapel, this is a great forum, a great complement to our sort of internal-facing meeting to reach out to a much broader community. Would love to see you submit there. The last thing I want to touch on here is last year we heard from Marjan. This is the first time she had presented at CHU. I believe she may be here today. Since we saw her here at CHU last year, Marjan defended her PhD, and her software, her Chapel software, is continuing to be used by her former research group. She now works for the Natural Resources of Canada, focused on parallel computing, so we're very excited for her. And then Thomas Rollinger, who's spoken at CHU a number of years, I believe, defended his PhD as well on compiler optimizations. He now works for NVIDIA's backend compiler team, so I wanted to congratulate both of them on being the newly minted doctors of Chapel, for lack of a better term. With that, I want to thank our team at HPE and the many of you in the community who I don't have headshots for to put onto this slide for all of the hard work this past year. We've gotten an amazing amount done. And to just summarize, as a team at HPE and broadly as a community, I think we have accomplished a ton since we saw you last year. Throughout the day today, you'll be hearing more detail about many of these efforts. Again, I'm looking forward to those talks myself, and we're really looking forward to working with you all in the year to come. I've got my standard set of resources here. Want to once again plug PA-ATM, and I'd be happy to take a question or two in the last few minutes here.
Thanks, Brad. We do already have one question or maybe comment in the chat suggesting in addition to the redesign of the website, it might be a good idea to redesign the documentation website and split it into several parts, tutorials, standard libraries, examples, that kind of thing, suggesting that the Python documentation is a good example of that. So,
okay,
thanks.
That's great feedback. I will mention that while we haven't done a major revamp of the documentation since last year, one of the things we have been doing, we've been hearing from users for years now that the search function is really, really aggravating. So Michael Ferguson in particular has been putting in a lot of effort to really improve our search results in terms of quality, in terms of the ordering of the results, and in terms of showing you what the results are. Like, is this a primer? Is this from the language spec? Things like that. So there have already been some improvements to the docs if you haven't seen that yet. But I agree. We could definitely do more to improve our docs, make them more coherent, bring them all into the same interface, and so on. Yeah, thanks for that feedback. Any other questions?
Those improvements, have they gone into the Chapel 2.0 docs or just into the pre-release 2.1 docs so far?
I think, so most of what I've just mentioned, I think, is only in the 2.1 docs. You can see that online, but you have to sort of opt into it typically. I think some of the initial results may have squeaked into 2.0, but yeah, 2.1 is probably where you're going to see most of the improvements there. Good question.
Okay, and Tiago asks, does distributed iterator take into account the new colocales concept in iteration?
Excellent question. I'm almost certain that the answer to that is yes. So the colocales themselves to the Chapel program, to the Chapel software, look just like normal locales. You still have that kind of normal 1D locales array. It's just that every pair of them or 4 of them or 8 of them, whatever the arity is, are mapped to the same compute node. So all software that is written to use locales like the distributed iterator should run just fine with colocales. You'll just get that finer grained partitioning. And so yeah, from the user's perspective, the only thing that should be necessary to use colocales is using a network that supports them, InfiniBand and Slingshot being the main 2. And using this new command line argument, and from there, your software should be kind of the same as ever. But you should hopefully see performance improvements as a result. Yeah, good question, Tiago. Thanks.
Yeah, if you do have questions for Brad right now or any of the presenters in any of the sessions, yeah, please, you can either react and put your hand up if you'd like to ask out loud on camera. We'd love to see your faces and hear your voices. Yeah, if you don't want to have your voice on the recording, that's also fine. Just put your questions in the chat as you've been doing, and the session chair will read them out.
All right, great. And I will also be around all day, and during the breaks and such, that's another opportunity to ask me questions or other speakers questions. And the breaks are something that, while we'll probably record them for simplicity, we won't be archiving on the website typically. So if you're camera shy, that'd be another chance to talk and ask questions. And I'm seeing we're out of time, so
yeah,
thanks very much, and welcome to ChapelCon.